Coogs house. It's AJ Haulcy in the transfer portal, Jeremiah Wilson in the transfer portal. Just not the most giving Easter weekend for the Coogs.
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougars, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to step by, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. We should make your first listen each and every day. If you want to join the conversation, but you don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below. If you're a fan of Peeps or not, today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Best place to get last week's lowest price guaranteed. Got more on that fun later. But we're talking about this all day today. We got a crossover with Brian Smith. He's the Locked On. He hosts Locked On the Portal. He also does all recruiting and transfer portal news all year long in college football. We got a whole crossover with him later to kind of talk about Keyshawn Anderson, big time 5-star recruit 2026 class, as well as the latest portal news in Houston. Because today we're going to talk about that portal news, which is that AJ Haulcy and Jeremiah Wilson kind of very last minute, to at least, enter the transfer portal. We're talking about what that looked like, what Houston's left to do, kind of start figuring out how to pick up the pieces of what's going on, talk about that kind of broad strokes, as well as some of the spring game and what that means for the spring ending in the Houston Cougar football program. But first, yes, you heard that right. I've hit it a couple times now. AJ Haulcy, who was all Big 12 a season ago, likely to be preseason All-American on a few lists when the lists come out next fall. Phil Steele had him as All-American last season, for what it's worth. He entered the transfer portal on Saturday. Under discussed here is that Jeremiah Wilson entered the transfer portal Friday morning after practices for Houston concluded on Thursday. Frankly, could you talk about a guy with great timing on that one? Because going into Easter weekend, Houston has their final practice Thursday, spring game on Saturday. Jeremiah Wilson enters the transfer portal on Friday morning. Jeremiah Wilson, big-time corner, dabbled in the portal for a hot second in December when the defensive coordinator change was happening and is now in it. For what it looks like on that, frankly, it looks like there might have been some schematic change there. He also was a very coveted corner as far as his talent goes. Some people had him one of the top corners in the Big 12 coming back next season and stuff like that, right? So he may be looking for the big payday, the exposure, the different defense coordinator system. He may, who knows, right? That's been a lot less discussed because of the way AJ Haulcy dipped out on the Cougs on Saturday. Look, I want to say this at the top. I really like watching AJ Haulcy play football. I really like watching Jeremiah Wilson play football. And so I don't mean any of this any other way than a guy that enjoyed watching them play football and wishes I could continue to watch them play for the Cougs. We'll talk about other course of the show today that this is in part just kind of part of the business now. But Haulcy, after the defensive coordinator change happened in the winter, was steadfast with the Cougs, right? That happens. Spring practice goes on. He is steadfast with the Cougs. Many coaches, Willie Fritz, Austin Armstrong, players as well, Connor Wegman, talked about his leadership, his strength throughout the spring practices when given chances and media availabilities. And AJ Haulcy played the spring game, got most of the spring reps. It sounded like most of the first team reps, I should say. And ultimately, within hours of the game ending, on social media, it was very public that he was entering the transfer portal. He was going to put his name in and leave. And I don't mean to alarm folks. This isn't one of those leaves like a dabble, put his feet in and potentially come back. I think this is real deal going. There's a real chance that he's going to be the best player on this team next year. I don't know that was a for sure thing. He certainly had the best resume. Obviously, Wegman, the quarterback, he had a bunch of new guys as well. And with that quarterback, does that open up a Rashawn Sanford or Boogie or whatever, right? Corey Platt coming back healthy. What does he look like? There's a bunch of options for who could have been the best player on this Houston Cougars football team next year. But if you were in Vegas betting, AJ Haulcy would have been one of the top guys. And, at 6 foot and pretty strong 215, pretty versatile safety. I've said in the show before, he's like the most throwback to 2005 kind of safety I can think of in the best way possible. I mean that. So both he and Jeremiah Wilson are in the transfer portal. And I will say that I was taken aback at the idea that Haulcy would do it that quickly after the spring game was over, after having just played the first team reps of the spring scrimmage. Did not, as a fan, sit with me the right way. I'm not gonna. You're okay to feel that way. I'm not. I don't. Not that you need my permission to, but that did feel crappy, for lack of a better phrase. I don't know how else to put it. It just felt crappy, and he ultimately, through his social media, has put out comments about putting his faith in the Lord, his career in God's hands, citing Corinthians about walking with the Lord and so on. And I'm not one to tell him he shouldn't bet on himself or take chances, scared money don't make none, etc. I will say that this does all strike me as not great timing. It feels like, between quotes of him saying he wants to go to a championship program, wants a chance to expose himself before he gets to the NFL and get exposure and all that kind of stuff. This feels like leapfrogging. The quote I think he tweeted out that makes it feel the most like that is that comfort kills more dreams than failure ever will. And again, the way that's phrased, it's hard to tell a kid he's doing something wrong by betting on himself, right? I think it just is a shame that there's this feeling that he couldn't have done that at Houston. Houston plays in the Big 12. He plays on these big stages. Houston offers, if you perform, spots to go to the NFL. We talk about Tank Dell. We saw Ed Oliver come in and turn the program around in the mid-2010s and the mid-teens there. This isn't an impossible thing to do. I certainly don't think it's a hard thing to do, especially when you're as talented as Haulcy is. And again, this feels like the kind of thing that had, if Haulcy wanted to go to the program for these kinds of reasons, not because he's upset about the way the coaching staff goes or anything like that, and there's been no indication of any of that. It feels the kind of thing you could have done in December, and Houston would have had time to figure it out. Instead, Houston kind of doesn't. Jeremiah Wilson, AJ Haulcy, both not just projected, were almost surefire things to start at a isolation corner and a down safety. They were for sure going to be impact players. They returned their vast majority of the interceptions returning for next season just out the door like that, and it's been about 36 hours. It makes for a rough weekend for the Coogs. On the field schematically, well, you can find another safety. I think part of the deal that Haulcy brought specifically to the table is he's so violent in that midsection of the field as a tackler that it really did kind of lead to alligator arm kind of moments. He also did knock balls loose that don't go down as turnovers, but do go down as incompletions. He's a force, and he's going to be good for wherever he goes. He'll play on Sundays, I think. I'm not trying to beat down the guy for making a decision that he thinks is best for his career, but it also is allowed to suck as a fan, right? Like, to have that both ends of that happening, I think it's not one of the things. It has to be one or the other. And I don't think it's right that you see people saying it has to be one or the other. And I want to keep diving into that thought process and why it's not one or the other, why it's also admittedly something Houston's got to look to get past in the spring and kind of quickly get a move on. Fritz is a guy that can move, and it's worth keeping an eye on. Can move the program forward, I should say, and we're just keeping an eye on how those things go. I also want to talk about this idea of, like, does this mean bad news for spring and spring practices in general? Because I don't think that's out the question here. Before we get to all that, I guess just should say that today's show, as I mentioned at the top, is brought to you by our buddies over at Game Time. There's no atmosphere quite like playoffs and playoff atmospheres. NBA playoffs going on right now. Houston, the Rockets hosting those playoff games. Every bucket, defensive stop moment feels huge, especially the Rockets don't get quite as many buckets. They're going to get more Wednesday. Watch. It's an electric arena with Game Time. You can be a part of that without the stress of last-minute ticket hunting. Game Time makes it easy. It makes it fast and easy both to get playoff tickets, even when demand is sky high. The price on the app actually goes down as tip-off gets closer, which is awesome. You get last-minute deals, save you up to 60%. I like the all-in pricing, the toggling where you can see what it's going to look like from that section and row in that arena for that event, because you can go to concerts, theater, basketball games, baseball, whatever, right? Take the guess. We're going to buy tickets at Game Time. Download Game Time app today. Use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Terms by again, creating conversation code Locked On College, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off that first purchase. Download Game Time today. It's got last week tickets, the lowest prices, guaranteed. Park Rangers, Locked On Coogs. Still lamenting over AJ Haulcy and Jeremiah Wilson walking out the door. I can see the comments being written down right now. Parker, they don't want to be Coogs. They'll walk. Yeah, but I wanted to be Coogs. And I think that's part about this, where you see people getting upset, people going crazy on Twitter and social medias and whatever. And I don't, part of being a fan is short for fanatic. It's totally okay to want a kid like Haulcy or a kid like Wilson. Haulcy's from Houston. Right, he came to Houston from New Mexico to come play at home. It's totally okay, I think, to be some high level even of upset with all of that. It's also, unfortunately, the reality of the business now. For instance, we're talking about players leaving the spring, the Nico character from Tennessee going to UCLA, and the UCLA quarterback going to Tennessee, and that whole swap of sorts is dominating college football storylines right now. This is the world. But what hasn't dominated storylines and hasn't dominated the world of storylines for like the better part of 40 or 50 years now is like position coaches could have done this forever, and coordinators could have done this forever. If, heaven forbid, I love Sean Bell, wanted to stay at Houston for a long time. If he were to get a $850,000 offensive coordinator call today, he'd take it, and that's the way that business has always been, and he'd go. And the players don't have the same flexibility until fairly recently, so this feels all new. And I have to keep reminding myself of that like this is just a response to a large problem where players had no say in their college careers or very little say in their college careers. And as much as it feels like the pendulum swung too far the other way, it needed to swing some. And I think that's really painful to think through in a lot of ways. And it doesn't make this easy. But I do think that's why this is only going to increase as we watch college football more, until there's some sort of more contractual obligations. And even in that, we see NFL holdouts and NBA sit-outs and all those kinds of things in pro sports, to where it's not like it's gone from those situations. Because ultimately, the guys calling the plays, guys that are position coaches, have always had this freedom of movement to the degree that they can. And so this is just this gigantic response to that. And so I don't say that I know where Haulcy's going or anything like that. I hadn't talked to AJ or Jeremiah for what it's worth. But I do feel like, this feels like they're both moving to not like, I don't envision these guys hopping just another Big 12 program. They were top-end Big 12 defensive players. I imagine they're going somewhere with big NIL packages. You're seeing Ole Miss is thrown around. You're seeing UT Austin thrown around. You're seeing big-time schools with big-time packages being thrown around. And ultimately, those schools are, through NIL, going to throw a lot more money. This isn't the kind of thing the House settlement fixes either. The House settlement is going to have money from the school, but NIL package is equivalent to an NBA player getting their House settlement money for a pro athlete would be the money they get from the franchise, the club. Great. But then they sign the big Nike deal, and that's awesome, right? The NIL packages are more like that big Nike deal. It has nothing to do with what that school money is going to be, right? And so until you start putting regulations on that, and I'm not sure how much regulation we want on those when we don't regulate other ways people make money. Like, there's just so many ways this thing spirals. And at some point, we root for Houston because it's the University of Houston. It's the U of H, regardless of who's in helmets and uniform. And I still think, for its worth, Houston got a good shot to be good next year. Houston's going to be improved at a lot of positions. Houston's got a lot of strength on offense. They did not have a year ago. Last year, they kind of had to have a top 30 defense just to go 4-8. This year, with the top 30 defense, they probably won a lot more games. I don't know what the defense ranks necessarily off the top of my head. I do know that at the safety position, we've been waiting for Maurice Williams to get a chance here. And this sounds like his chance. And what I love about Maurice Williams is he went to Twitter almost immediately and was like, it's my opportunity. It's my chance to shine. Something to that effect about like seizing the moment. And like, Mo and I don't talk a whole or anything like that, but like, I want this so bad for Maurice Williams, a kid that came to Houston as a high-end 4-star, had other Power 4 offers, had SEC offers. He came to Houston and said, I want to go to this school in this city and represent my city. He came to Houston, highly ranked recruit, had really good first spring game, gets redshirted, and then he's just kind of fallen back on the depth chart, admittedly because of how talented guys like AJ Haulcy were in front of him. But he's kind of become an afterthought as like the next kid doing the same thing as Keyshawn Henderson, the top recruit in 2026 in the state of Texas, is coming to Houston, right? And he's doing the same thing, wants to put the city on his back and so on. And we kind of forget that like Maurice Williams did that already, right? Moa wears 27 for June 27th. The city of Houston's a big day for us. Like that's a fun spin on this whole thing is like ultimately this could be opening the door for Maurice Williams. You'll also see both in replacing Haulcy and Jeremiah Wilson, Houston do a number of things, I'm sure, in the transfer portal, going after DBs and things like that. And I can see you already shaking your head and getting a little upset with the thought like, well, what does this afterthought mean? We're going to go take some bench guy or whatever. But schools are also across the board about to have to cut their rosters down to a strict 105-person roster. There are bloated rosters of 140 plus dudes out there where they've got a bunch of walk-ins, a bunch of this, a bunch of that. And ultimately, you're going to see a lot of guys that, yes, they were freshmen at big programs not going to play, but they're going to go ahead and throw their own name. They're going to throw their own name in the transfer portal. They're going to get out of things, and they're going to bounce from their programs over the course of the next 5 or 6 days. Teams and players have until the end of the week to formally file to transfer. Then players that are cut actually don't have to transfer in the same transfer portal window under the same rules because they're cut, right? And so it's a little bit different. So you see a bunch of names enter the portal, of course, the next week or so. And I want to stress that when a guy enters the portal, he doesn't have to exit the portal to a new program by the time the portal is closed. You have, frankly, until like August to do that. And so you see in Houston, I'm sure a bunch of those guys, and we're going to break those guys down as they get recruited and talked to and whatever. I imagine you see Houston go after some, though. And what we got to remember about Willie Fritz here as he does this is that Fritz made a career out of most of his stops in finding those guys that are under-recruited. Tajay Spears, someone no one wants. He takes him at Tulane, turns him into a pro, right? Fritz does that a lot. Fritz is also a defensive guy. He's got an eye for defensive players. The kind of defense they ran at Tulane, I think, speaks to that most don't have. Fritz is a really talented evaluator. And so I think there's a good chance he's going to have his eyes on some guys that either are young in the portal or, maybe castaways from whatever, and he's going to find some way that they fit what he and Houston want to do because he's had a knack for doing that his whole career. It's been a long, successful career at that. And so I would keep an eye on what kind of guys look at Houston, because truthfully, it might not be a lot of guys with a lot of game tape to go watch. It might not be a big name that you've heard of necessarily, but if we're going to continue to trust that this was the right hire, and again, the only issue I had with the hire when it happened was the idea of energy of a guy in his mid-60s, and he's proven me wrong at every turn on that. I think that if we continue to trust the Fritz move and the way the staff is progressing, I think it's fair to say like they're gonna make some good moves as this goes, because they've continued to show that. I mean, some of the most talented players last season were guys that came in under Fritz's company, whether that's Keith Cooper or they elevated Rayshawn Sanford last season. Zion Chris came in and ended up taking over the starting quarterback job. Like, they have a knack for finding these different spots, and I think that it's worth letting them try that again, right? Now, Houston's going to have to get better. They went 4-8 last season. Unless they just straight up can't replace Haulcy and Wilson. And even then, again, like I said, Maurice Williams can, I think, step in and help out some here. Even if they can't replace Haulcy and Wilson, I think this is a team that's looking at bowl games. And I don't mean that, send a bunch of smoke that way and whatever. I think this is a program that's ready to take that jump into bowl season and kind of like start setting that floor now. Especially with how much better I think the offense is going to be. But we're going to talk about a lot of that after the spring. Spring's wrapped up, so I have a lot of that to talk about as well as more transfer portal talk. But I want to talk about the spring as a whole in a second, because I think there's some more to talk about with this idea of a spring game and scrimmage. But first, today's show is brought to you by Monarch Money as well. If you ever took your bank account and you wonder where all my money go, dining, online shopping, entertainment, a bunch of money spent at the spring clearing out sale at Houston Cougar football. It's easy to lose track of where that money's going. And with Monarch Money, personal CFO gives you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is not just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, spending in one place. Stop just managing your money. Start building your wealth. I like how easy the singular app is for all things. And I teach, I coach, I podcast. My wife's got jobs. We all one app, one singular app. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. Parker Answer, the Locked On Coogs here. And I want to talk about the end of the spring with you all. And I bring this up briefly with Brian. I want to bring this up briefly with Brian and the episode coming out later today as well, as he looks at things nationally. We've kind of talked about spring football for some time now as a macro level conversation. First, Matt Rule and Dana Holgorsen in Nebraska brought up the idea of getting rid of the spring game altogether. That feels like one half of the conversation. The other end of the spectrum here is that you got Deion Sanders in Colorado saying, we'll play someone like Syracuse, bring it on, right? We talked about you play your BUI buy games at the end of the spring instead of in the fall to kind of use it as a tune-up and feel good about yourself going into the spring. And I think all options have value. I have to say, though, that as Houston watches starters walk into the transfer portal just before and just after their spring football game, it's hard not to think what Matt Rule said in Nebraska carries some weight here. Now, A.J. Haulcy does not need spring game film to go get recruited. He's got the Oklahoma game. He's got the Utah game. He's got the Kansas State game. He's got the TCU game. He's got plenty of real games to put out there to get recruited in the transfer portal. He doesn't need this. But my worry is that his backup might have, or that third receiver might have. And at some point, they have the same flexibility that he did. Now, I don't think any of those guys should leave Houston. I think they've got great opportunity here. And frankly, I could talk about other reasons you want to stay in the city of Houston and go to the University of Houston instead. But it's hard not to harken back to this idea of like, why do we play the spring game all together? Why do we play it at all? Right? Schools are taking their spring games off of ESPN, where they used to put them on for marketing. The thought there is that they don't want to advertise who their players are. They don't want to show you on a national televised audience what their guys can do, what their guys look like now they've gained 10 pounds in the spring, what their guys can look like now they're healthier on that ankle, what their guys can look like now they've had a year of college level coaching. They don't want to put that out there on national tape. And that's not because film's not available. The kids can download their own video and then hop in the portal and take it with them, because once they download it, it's theirs, right? It's to prevent the tampering level of things. And I don't mean to be like beating around the bush with this. Tampering is the thing that happens. It's ubiquitous, and frankly, it was one of the under-the-table things that was happening before all of this. We go back to what was the SMU documentary, 30 for 30, Pony Excess, right? It was happening then, right? And it's always happened, but the tampering would happen in this case when you are flipping through ESPN Plus, you start watching spring games, spring scrimmages, keeping an eye on things like, that guy looks pretty good, and start. And I don't mean to say that, and I want to prank some people I've been DMing on throughout the weekend. We did Easter, and we were out of town, and so I was away from my computer, my setup. Didn't get to do a whole lot of this. But I want to bring some people on this week to talk about like how prevalent that is, and if that's a real reason to lean into ending these spring games and spring televised events, right? Because ultimately, these are for the fans, and that's part of the reason like Houston didn't put theirs on ESPN Plus, but did have a bunch of fans turn out. But ultimately, with the feeling coming out of the weekend for Houston and the talent leaving the sideline or leaving the field, really, because they're both starters, it's hard not to think like, what measures can we take to protect this roster? Houston's going to find diamonds in the rough. Willie Fritz continues to, but you can't have your diamonds plucked over every time you dig them out of the rough, right? And so as Houston continues to build, I think it's something we got to keep an eye on is what are you going to do at the end of spring to kind of keep these guys in the third ward. Now, part of that also comes out in NIL, paying for Lincoln Coug things and putting money towards that. I know we partnered with Roy in the past to continue to give money towards the football programs. Signing that over and helping support the program wherever you can is important. It may end up playing a role in these two exoduses. We'll see. But ultimately, I sit here still sounding 28 minutes in pretty dumbfounded. And I talked to Brian in a little bit, and that'll be live for you in a little bit as well. Still, like, I still think I'm going to be a little bit like, what just happened this weekend to the Coogs, right? Coming down off of the high of Easter weekend and taking my toddler out looking for eggs and all of that, ham and big brunches and all of that. And it's like, okay, now that we're back in reality, the Coogs, man, the Coogs. Anyway, we'll be breaking that down. I'd like to talk some about the women's program, the women's basketball program building itself up this week. We'll talk more about as more guys add themselves to the basketball welcoming themselves back list. All of that and more here each and every day at Locked On Coogs. We describe it the best. We're live. Locked On Coogs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Coogs.